those who don't know each other. And then for the benefit of our public here and watching, the format of our work sessions is that we will have discussion, and if time allows, we'll have questions from the audience if desired. If not, we welcome people to stay afterwards and deliver any public comment at our regular board meeting, which starts at 7 o'clock. We do need to wrap up by 6:45 in order to break down the chairs and tables and put the room in board meeting order so that we have one committee interview before we start the regular meeting. So, with that, Clint Wilson, Mayor.
Kevin Ryan, Trustee.
David Hopper, Planning Commission.
Anthony Stewart, Planning Commission.
Matt Magley, Manager.
Kendra Cartwright, Town Attorney.
Sandy Pennington, Mayor Pro Tem.
Sandy Emerly, Trustee.
Lisa Ritchie, Vice Chair, Planning Commission.
Rita Dozell, Trustee.
Chris Hansen, Trustee.
Mark Lasis, Trustee.
All right. Matt, I'll let you start us off.
And tonight we had a request from the board to have a meeting, work session that we could all get together and just talk about the design guidelines as they pertain to downtown Superior project. There's a number of new people on both the Planning Commission and Town Board, so I thought it'd be beneficial for the newer members to have a discussion of the design guidelines, how they apply to the current project, as well as moving forward with future applications we might have. I think that tonight the goal is not to discuss these as it pertains to any particular active application, but more in general to the project and from a historic perspective. Kendra's here to answer any questions you may have from a legal perspective, and then me and Stephen Williams and Martin are here as well from a staff perspective to answer any questions the board might have.
Okay. Very good. Are there particular areas that board members would like to start with to jump into, talk about more detail?
What I would just like Kendra to restate again, how these guidelines are used in an FDP, in an application. And,
Sure.
And legally binding they are, or what are they?
Sure. So the design guidelines are part of the plan development. As you will see if you've read through them, there's numerous references in the design guidelines to the fact that they're binding, despite the fact that they're called guidelines. They are binding design criteria, I would call them. So they should be applied to each application as applicable. There are some that are applicable to different areas within the town center, but they need to be complied with, basically. Even though they're called guidelines, the way that it's written, they are supposed to be binding. There are some areas in which they conflict, and as I think I've advised the board in the past, and I would say the same to the Planning Commission, is if you identify an area of conflict, it's up to you to determine what's more consistent with the overall intent of the plan development, the comprehensive plan, and those kinds of things. Because there are some areas where they're ambiguous, or they're not clear, or they conflict with, or seemingly conflict with other sections. So we have to do the best we can with the way that they're written. I know that we had some issues with this recently with specific sections, but it is incumbent upon the board and the Planning Commission to review these in relation to each application and determine whether they've been met.
What was the genesis of the guidelines? How did they come about? Who drafted them? Who paid for them? Whose idea was their creation? If you could speak to just kind of the general backstory.
Yeah, I think it was.
About.
It was. I mean, we spent, Sandy and Chris, we spent several, and I think Rita was on the Plan Commission, and Clint may have been with me, several meetings going through the design guidelines, page by page, sometimes word by word, to try to get something that everybody was somewhat happy with as far as the development and what we wanted, what we envisioned for the development. And I think the developer wanted some assurances from what they could get from the development, and the town wanted some assurances on what we were going to get. from aesthetics and what it's going to look like. And those
Who
types.
actually wrote them?
Well, the developer drafted them,
Right.
and then we responded to the draft, and
Right.
they would make revisions, and we'd come back.
Yeah, if I remember right, the first draft, the 2012 iteration,
Right.
was the town contracted.
Right.
And Oz drafted these, and then Ranch Capital, when they went under contract on the property, they took that same document then and
Reworked it.
revised sections of it. So the initial framework was initially paid for by the town.
That's correct.
And then Ranch Capital modified the
And-
existing document.
Yeah, in 12, the property owners were the other party that was having input on the
Yeah.
design guidelines.
And how much did the town spend drafting?
Did just the design guidelines themselves?
Yes.
I'd have to go back and check.
I understand the same way Lisa Ritchie. We went through excruciating detail in 2012 as a town board. And when a specific developer came in, I think they used them as a basis, and then they modified. And then we had the back and forth and back and forth and back
Yep.
and forth to approve a final document. I attribute some of the inconsistencies to the fact red lines were not provided in the early stages of the submissions by Ranch Capital. So literally, every time a new one came out, you had to read every line of this document. I swear to God, I had it mostly memorized. By the time we had got down the road with it, and then we insisted that there be red lines provided, and that made it a whole lot easier. So I'm actually reading it again for this meeting, somewhat impressed that we articulated as much as we did in these design guidelines. I think they have a lot in them. And I recommend if there's anybody who's running for the board, that if you're elected, read them. And those of you who are on the board or the planning commission, read them once, then twice, then 3 times, starting from the back a couple of times, because by the time you get in the middle of them, you're brain dead, right? So you gotta, because this is your Bible, and just to reiterate what Kendra said, it's 2.3 on page, I have a hard copy, but section 2.3 that says the PD amendment together with the design guidelines supplement establish the requirements and criteria standards for review and approval by the town of all uses and activities for future final development plans within the Superior Town Center. So that, I call that to your attention, because Kendra's not just asserting, it's actually in this document. That's what these are. So that's all for this particular comment.
Was there an expectation that this was a living document, or it was?
Nope.
Nope.
No.
So
I mean, honestly, we recommended that they be guidelines and that it be a living document and that not go over.
So things that are not necessarily ambiguous, but things that are undefined, using, for example, the flat roof example.
Mhm.
Is that something that a document like this, in your experience, Kendra, has been revised to define?
You mean if you want to just add a definition of flat roof?
Yes.
We can't revise this document without a PD amendment.
Okay, that's my question.
Yep.
So it requires a PD amendment.
Yep.
Thank you.
And that is on the reverse of that, is if an applicant want to go outside of this and do something different, it would be an exception, or it would require an amendment to the PD plan.
Or variance.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
It would be an exception.
If there is
or
a
change.
non-conforming application, right? Like
Mhm.
somebody submits an FTP within the town center, right? That is, whether it's inconsistent with the guidelines or inconsistent with the PD, the board has the discretion to approve any application if it deems that that is an improvement over what has been approved thus far.
After due public input
Sure,
and
after
hearings.
a hearing.
And after much engagement over that, because this was 50 hours in multiple, like 10 different meetings or 8
Right.
of getting these. And again, it wasn't that in order to restrict the developer asked for them.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, so now then to come back and have an applicant say, oh, I don't like those guidelines and I want to do something else, it would have to be pretty significantly advantageous to the town to allow for a change from these guidelines. That would be my perspective.
So my question for Kendra is, the board has the discretion to approve an FDP that doesn't comply with PD
Yes.
and has the discretion to approve an FDP that doesn't comply with the design guidelines.
Correct.
And the
That's-
mechanism to do that is the board has to deem it to be an improvement.
Yes.
That's what our town code says.
That's right, and also section 2.5 of the guidelines themselves. So I would refer you to there, where it says, the town encourages innovation and is receptive to new ideas. The town board of trustees may approve variances or modification to the approved PD amendment, including the design guidance supplement, pursuant to the procedures in the town code for amending a plan development plan. Again, this is not super clear,
Yeah.
but, because it talks about.
Because it talks about two things.
It's talking about two separate
Yeah.
things. So one is saying, yes, the PD amendment and guidelines can be amended by a new PD and new guidelines, but it also talks about variances, which is what Trustee Lacis is referring to in the town code, where we specifically say variances from in an FDP from the original PD can be approved if they show innovation in design or other issues like that. So, so yes, there's the ability to approve an FDP that does not comply fully. There's also an ability, as we already knew, to amend the PD if we want to change design guidelines.
And there's also the ability to say no
Yes.
to one that doesn't conform.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So
Kendra,
those are the three options.
Yes.
go to this issue of setting precedent, because if we approve a variance from these, does it set a precedent that exists into future considerations of different FDPs, or is it everyone a separate event?
Everyone is separate legally, so each application you see has separate circumstances and separate, and you would need to make clear, I would advise you to make clear if you're approving a variance in an FDP what that's based on. The next application you get will not have exactly that same circumstance, so that's the difference there. So it doesn't create a legal precedent. It could create an expectation on the part of developers that if you waive certain things for one, that you may also waive it for another. But that's not a legal issue, so.
And just so I understand, Kendra, so our town code for FDPs, it's section 16-10-40, and that's what it says, that an FDP which has been modified to reflect improvements in design or changes which have occurred in its natural surroundings and environment since the time of the PD plan review and approval.
Correct.
So the board may approve. And we talked about this previously, the way our code currently reads, is that the planning commission may approve to
Yes.
the board.
Yes.
And that was a lingering
That's, yes.
leftover from when the planning commission had jurisdiction over FDP approvals as opposed to the board. So that's something that we need to change.
Yes, that is something we should change in the code at some point. Probably next time we do a revision to chapter 16, we should take a look at just fixing that. That is a remnant. It used to be that the planning commission approved FDPs. The board never even saw them. So that's a remnant there because it does specifically say the planning commission may approve an FDP which has been modified. But in my mind, the planning commission can do it. The board of trustees can also do it, since the board of trustees is typically now the final decision maker on an FDP.
And the first sentence of what you read at 2.5 says, these guidelines cannot anticipate all conditions and unique circumstances within the Superior Town Center and changes that may occur over the period of build-out. Then it goes to your sentence, the town
Right.
encourages innovation, is receptive to new ideas.
Right.
So that's just the facts of the matter. It tried to be pretty comprehensive, but can't be all comprehensive. So Matt, a question for you. As I read 2.3, the PD amendment together with this design guidelines supplement. So the word supplement is was put in there, am I correct, because it supplements anything that's put forth in the PD amendment?
Correct.
I mean, we hashed over that one too.
We hashed over whether the
Yeah.
word supplement should be in
Yeah.
there. We hashed over whether the word guidelines should be in
Right,
there. We
right.
went through every single
Right.
iteration of this.
So, when Chris and I are off this board in November, we are the lone rangers on familiarity with that original PD amendment, right? I happen to have mine at home. I probably won't ever have the courage to burn it because it's got so much ink on it that I put on it at the time. So it shows intent, right? Because it was put on there at the time. How do we make new members of the trustees and new planning commission members, how do they become proficient in the PDA in itself, that document? Do we make copies of that finalized PDA available to all of them when they're seated?
They're already on the website.
They're on the website, and then staff meets with each new planning commissioner to go over different documents.
Right.
And as well as new board members are, Kendra and I both meet with new board members and go over different documents.
Okay, so,
So reading
that
them
has
is
to be.
one thing, but maybe intent, reading them is one thing, but maybe the intent behind that is different.
Right.
So
Well,
how do we get that from?
I just think it needs to be in the training manual for new trustees, new planning commissioners, that on matters pertaining to the Superior Town Center, you've got to become familiar with the PDA. You got to become familiar with the guidelines. I mean, more than familiar, you got to know them. And then how do we track in that original PDA the subsequent amendments that were made in, we're now to Amendment 3, right?
Right.
Okay, so how do we track those to bring up that document to current?
Well,
Yeah.
we'll cover that in our staff
Mhm.
reports
Right.
to the planning commission and town board both, and reference specific areas within the PDA that apply to whatever application you might be looking at.
But given online technology, I would suggest there be some way to take that master PDA and having read the subsequent amendments superimposed on it. So when somebody reads it, they don't get in their mind, oh, this is what it is. No, that aspect might have been amended. When I went through, what I think is the most important part of this whole book is all of these things at the end. That's why you got to start at the end. It does say PD Amendment 3 here, right?
Right.
So I think I've got a current book, but if I happen to have pulled one of my old ones off the shelf, that would not be in here now, right? So I wouldn't be reading current information. So it's very important that all the decision makers for this town have this document fully up to date and have the online documents fully up to date.
Do all the staff memos on any development applications within town center reference the pertinent provisions in the design guidelines that could be applicable? I know they sometimes do. Is it always?
The ones that
Not.
pertain to that application will be addressed in the staff memo. I mean, Stephen's staff memos are very thorough. They're, sometimes 25 pages long.
I would say reading him, in my experience, I feel like he does call out the pertinent, just from recollection. And the other thing that I really appreciate about staff's memos, and maybe we need to beef them up a little bit, are the discussion on the exceptions, because I feel like the exceptions, calling out the exceptions, is really important, I think, for us as reviewers, to make sure we understand what exceptions we're considering. And then it's also helpful from my perspective to have staff's analysis of those exceptions to understand, from their perspective, if they're supportive of the idea or not, and why or why not. So I think calling out the exceptions in the staff reports is pertinent.
I think that's one of the issues, though. The exceptions are not going to be as black and white as we'd like them to be.
They're probably not. I don't think they are.
Using the recent examples of
The height
orientation
waiver.
on the street,
Oh, right.
or the street orientation, or the height was particular because you had to measure, it was you had to take out a calculator to determine the height of the building, which I don't think people necessarily expected, looking at the town code. At least I personally wasn't that familiar with that portion of the code. Or the big one for me is the definition of a flat roof versus slope roof.
Right. So
without-
whether or not it actually
without having
needs
to
an
pitch,
exception.
right, so in each of those, or even, another example, where I believe, and it's probably too close to an application to even bring up here, but where I believe it is an exception, and I think I'm probably the minority to think that was a request for variance about, it was related to setbacks. That's the example. So it'd be great if we can call things out, but I think that's, from my perspective, what I
Right.
would love to have is for the planning commission to say, these are not necessarily exceptions.
Interpretations, maybe.
Our interpretation is, this is either requires a variance or might require your eyes to see if it's a variance,
Right.
so.
Kevin, I fully support that from even a different perspective, is then we know our planning commissioners are totally fluent
Right.
in this document, and we know our staff's totally fluent in this document, right? It can't be overstated. For example, 1.6, Chris and I keep saying that this was the expectation, and I was so pleased to see this in this document. And 1.6, community design concept components. Planning area 3 is a transition neighborhood that includes lower intensity residential, recreation, education, and commercial uses oriented to the extension of Coal Creek Drive. Okay, so when we say that was the expectation, it's certainly nice to see it in writing. And if a decision is made other than this actually has to be noted, that this,
Sure.
yeah, that kind of thing. Another thing that I found, that I was delighted to have found it, is 4.9. Letter F, public art. Public art is required to add interest and character. Simple sentence. But public art is not only expected and desired, it's required, according to this. So we then have every right to say to the developer, what public art commitment are you making, or are you going to make, right? That kind of thing.
I think too that we look at this and we see there's minimums and maximums in here, and then there's leeway below that or above that, depending on which you are. But you can't just, if there's a maximum on height, you can't just blow that off and say, well, we want it because the slope is different and things like that. We have to have that described to us and defined by staff and or the planning commission. And then every decision on a variance is made based on if it's in the best interest of the town of Superior. Granted, we need to understand what the developer or the applicant is asking for and why they're asking for it. But when you first look at it, is this in the best interest of the town of Superior to do this? And can we make this change and still hold to that premise that it's good for the town as well as for the developer? And that's the way we should look at all of these. And again, minimums and maximums. I was talking with Matt about this the other day. I've told Stephen this many, many times. When it says a setback can be 0 to 8 feet, that's the minimum setback. If they want to make it 15 feet, that's not a variance, as far as I'm concerned. That's a, thank God.
Maximum, though?
Huh?
Minimum and maximum, or just minimum?
That if a setback is 0 to 8 feet, that's what it says. You can have anywhere from 0 to 8 feet, but the developer or applicant came in and said, I want a 15-foot setback for that house. Why wouldn't we want that to be? We wouldn't, when it was before, it was usually 8 to 15 feet, and then that got changed to 0 to 8 feet. So, there's sometimes it's just automatic that you're going to allow for a change from what's there, because in that case, a setback minimum is 0 to 8 feet. You have to have somewhere between 0 and 8, which sounds odd, because 0 is nothing, is minimum. But you can't have less than 0, you can't be on the sidewalk, I guess. And the other thing too is that when we look at, I'm looking at 3.1 here, it says the overall project density maximums again. It doesn't say that we guarantee or anybody's guaranteeing 444,600 square foot of commercial retail or office of 373,000 or residential units of 1,400. It's the maximum that's been agreed to with the developer, and then there's no guarantee that either one of us has to make that we're going to have 1,400 residential units no matter what, and even if that means changing the guidelines to make them fit, Or on the other side of that, if you can't physically fit in 444,600 square feet of commercial retail, we can't insist that the applicant do that. You know, if it doesn't fit within their application. Wouldn't that be correct, Kendra?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, because we had gotten the one response is that we have to do everything in our power to make sure that the developer, even if it means reducing the setbacks and all that, and making the density higher, gets to 1,400 designated units, residential units. That's not our requirement as a town, to ensure that they're able to build this many units or square feet footage of the summarization of the maximum density here on 3.1.
I would just make one clarification on the setback. All the language in here also talks about it being a build-to line,
Mhm.
which from an interpretation perspective, a build-to line is what you want to hit. So I wouldn't take your interpretation then that your maximum setback is optional when you're also talking it in the same language as height and other things like that. To me, that reads as very intentional. When you read about all the language, buildings pushed up to the street. These are build-to lines, they're not
But this was intentional from the developer, not from us.
But we approved it.
We approved it, right.
So we have to honor it.
But we have to honor it, but it also, it says, it doesn't make us have to tell them
No,
if they
no.
want to be 15 feet.
We can approve it as an exception.
Right. So
Certainly.
that's what I'm saying about that. We had larger, greater setbacks. This is what was asked for by the developer, because they wanted to pull it as close as they could up to the sidewalks and the streets. And, but again, for the town, and the best interest of the town would be if we were set back further and we had more articulation.
In some opinions.
In some locations, some places within the development, because it's a big development.
Right. I would just, anyway, I think a lot of this is up for interpretation. And I get, it's challenging to listen to the developer come forth with an application that meets what's in here and then be told, well, it might meet what's in here, but it doesn't meet the intent of what we initially approved. And I get that maybe there's some discrepancies in there, but I feel like from a training of, I really recognize, Trustee Hansen's and Trustee Pennington's background on this, and same with Trustee Bazell and the Mayor. You guys have been, in that for a long time, and I don't want to discount that original intent, but I feel like when there is a discrepancy legally, this is our document. And I feel like we lose sight of that sometimes. And maybe it needs to be a process through an exception rather than, well, it doesn't really matter because that's not what we intended. So I think we just need to watch that carefully from a legal perspective through findings or whatever, however we're approaching these decisions related to things that deviate from what are hard and fast standards in here, where it's not necessarily kind of an interpretation.
Do you have an example of what you're talking about, Lisa?
I think the setback
Oh,
is the example. Where, that's not what was intended, so we don't really care whether, no, that is what's in here. It's a hard and fast regulation.
I think
Therefore,
we're
it should be
talking past each other.
Then it should be an exception.
Yeah, I think we're talking past each other.
I think I
on that one.
understand, so can I just,
Yeah.
so we don't misunderstand the setback, I think the setback is almost like a maximum height limitation.
Yeah.
If the height limitation is, say, 35 feet, somebody proposes 31 feet, that wouldn't require a variance, that would be
It's compliant.
if you're
Right.
compliant. And similarly, a setback is, you must set back in this particular range. I was in the meeting when we were reduced it down to 0 to 8, and I was scratching my head why that happened, but I think there was a compelling reason. I wasn't on that side, I was on this side. But it is a minimum setback, and I do think Rita's observation is correct, that if somebody proposes something that would otherwise be equal to 9 or 10 feet or 12 feet as a defined setback, which is in architectural terms a defined term, I wouldn't have an expectation for the planning commission to call that out as a variance. You might call it out as good news, this is going to be lovely, and allow for some additional tables or restaurants or something else because it exceeds the setback requirement, but it's not an example of a variance. I think that was your...
Mhm. Yes, thank you. Mhm.
If that's the language, then I agree with you. I just feel like in some instances that there's just the applicability we pick and choose. I think, and it feels like sometimes we pick and choose which standards.
I would like to not pick and choose.
I don't want to,
Right,
and
right.
that's my point, exactly. I feel like.
Well, I don't know that we pick and choose. If we're picking and choosing, that should be called out at the time.
Right, I agree. And I think an
Totally.
example of.
Like
the-
your flat roof thing.
Right, the flat roof
We
example, so my flat roof,
discussed
the
that
flat roof, or
thoroughly,
the street orientation.
Right.
From this point forward, I'm sure any application where this board and the next board and the next board after that is going to be aware of the orientation to the street. Language that is in that. And the first time that a detailed discussion of that occurred was only a few meetings ago.
And I feel like the planning commission, or at the planning commission level, that we really do look at and refer to the design guidelines when making a decision on any variances, and have significant discussion amongst ourselves prior to saying this is a variance, or this isn't a variance, or let's approve this a variance and pass it on to the board, or let's not approve this variance. So for me, there's less interpretation at that level, because I think we're pretty focused on meeting those guidelines, making sure that the application meets the standards that's required as well, and then moving on.
The problem that I see, that just beat this horse a little. So like on the flat roofs section, 8.4B, right? It says roof forms and materials. And under B it says generally. That's how that section starts.
That is a section, not the only section.
But this is for roof forms and materials, right, under the residential guidelines. Generally, for structures lower than 35 feet, and then it goes on to talk about gable or hip roofs are preferred for the primary roof form. And everything flows from that, right? I think that that's potentially ambiguous and leads to a discussion as to whether or not somebody wants
Let me
to.
repeat something. Go to the end of that long section. Flat roofs shall be limited to secondary roof forms only within planning area 3. So you got to take that into account too. You have to read.
Right,
the
I think you have to
entire
read. We have to read the whole thing, and you need to reconcile it. And I think when you do that, there's numerous instances within the design guidelines when you read these things where it is open to reasonable interpretation. That's to Lisa's point.
Right.
And the point is that these guidelines, I understand. We spend a lot of time drafting them and trying to get them as good as we can get them. But we're all human, right? And we draft things in a way, and as much as we want the intent to be preserved, these guidelines are going to outlive all of our terms here on the board.
Right.
And there is going to be a future board that's going to read that differently than we're reading it now. And you read it when you wrote it 4 years ago. And I think that in order to give certainty to the public, to any applicants that are submitting things, to ourselves, that's the rub with all of this, is how do we reconcile these areas, because it's undisputed that we can approve any application if we decide that it's an improvement. The uncertainty that the public has is which of these guidelines is going to be enforced and which is not. And the same uncertainty is with the applicant. Which guideline potentially could prevent my application from going through? And that's the tricky question in all of this. Because the public, I think, is entitled to be able to rely on these things because we work so hard to approve them.
With their input.
With
their public input.
With public input, with the developers. But the developer should be able to rely on them as well. Any applicant that's submitting something, relying on these things. The problem is when something falls through the cracks. So how do we, I think to Lisa's point is, how do we flag those potential issues so they don't become a surprise at the 11th hour of a board meeting, but instead are raised first with the planning department, with the planning commission, in all of the memos that are drafted by staff for the planning commission, for the board, so the public is informed, so the applicant is informed, and so it's not a last minute, all of a sudden issue that really shouldn't be a last minute issue. If it's reasonably subject to dispute, to some interpretation, this should be something that is flagged from the outset of the application. And that's what I'm hoping that we can accomplish by this discussion here tonight.
Right.
And going forward is, in considering any application, if there's any reasonable concern about any particular issue in the design guidelines, Section 8.4B, Section 10.1C, that those things are flagged. Because if an applicant knows about them at the outset, they say, okay, you know what, I can address that now before I spend all this time, money, and effort and preparing something that's going to get voted down. Similarly, that the public, the planning commission, and town board knows about them. So to the extent that we know this is what the applicant actually wants, that we're all at least reasonably alerted to those potential issues, so it doesn't become kind of a last minute.
But it all starts with familiarity.
Right.
If our planning staff is totally familiar with this, then the planning staff can identify, oh no, we gotta think about this, right?
Sandy, you're referring to staff.
Planning staff.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
Matt's staff.
Town staff.
Planning,
Town staff.
Town
Yeah.
staff. Starts there. That's why this meeting today is so important. Our planning staff has to be totally fluent in this document and be able to pick up the incongruities, et cetera, and raise those to the planning commission's attention. And the planning commission has to be as totally familiar with this, and the sitting board has to be totally familiar with it. And then you've got to also be familiar with other documents out there too. For example, we know that the Tract H, the buffer, is a point of contention in this community, right? What's the interpretation? So if you go to I'd have to go here. 1C7, it's 1C5. On my page, it's on page 111. I don't know what it's on. 1-11. It says the largest open space parcel in the southern neighborhood is the large open space area along the length of the south property line. I hope we can all agree. I think it's described in Tract H, right? I'm still trying to figure out where you are. Yeah, here.
Where are you?
Okay, go to 1.6 Community Design Concept
Okay.
Components.
Yep.
Follow it all the way to C.
Oh, yeah, got it, okay, yeah, the largest open space parcel in the
Right.
southern
Then
neighborhood.
go to 5, Roman numeral 5. The largest open space parcel in the southern neighborhood is a large open space area along the length of the south property line. Tract H, right? Am I reading that right, Matt?
That's correct.
Tract H?
Yeah.
Okay, look at the next sentences. The uses in this area will be determined by the town, right? So this document gives the town total discretion, right?
That's on the plan development plan as well,
Right.
stated.
Right, but we know that there exists this letter from the attorneys back to whenever, Rita, that also puts forth what can happen there. So this is...
Yeah, but we already went through that, that was superseded by this.
Right, but this is why there are disagreements among the people we represent and ourselves. When we say, no, we can do total discretion to the town, and the residents of the affected neighborhood said, no, you can't, right? So I'm just saying, that's where these things arise.
And I think we had to, some of us define the town as the body of residents that make up the town, not the board. So, so determined by the town, in my mind, isn't just us, the board or the staff alone, it has engaged the residents too. And I think you probably would agree with that,
Right.
Sandy, that the town doesn't just mean the board of directors. The town is the body of residents and businesses that make up the town.
Yeah, I agree, all the processes set up.
Yeah.
But that is one of the things in here that will cause lots of conversation.
Right.
Is what I'm saying.
Right.
It opens the door to a lot of conversation. And another one for me is 1.6C, right above it probably. 4, yeah. The last sentence of 4. Developed open space will also be integrated with most of the housing types. We've had that discussion numerous times where it's densely homes, a lot of density and no green. Well, that sentence, again, very simple sentence, but the intent of the board and the people doing this, including the developer who submitted the first several drafts of this, is that developed open space will be there, right? It does say most housing types, but this creates the expectation that there will be green, pockets of green throughout the development, if you pay attention to that sentence. So I think it was you, Rita, who said, where's the green?
Yeah, and the community aspect in the southern, we're talking about the southern, we're not talking about on Main Street, which we're gonna hear
Right.
more about. It's the concept for along Main Street and what residential units might be there, but we were talking more about planning area 3, which is the southern.
Yeah, the
southern
heading
half
of this
the
C,
development.
well, it says open, interestingly, it says open space and parks. It doesn't say like planning area 3, or does it? It's, the first sentence of it says the southern neighborhood will feature
Right.
a village green in the middle of Cold Creek Drive.
And southern is usually defined in other places in the document as planning area 3, for the development, planning area 3, not as confused with PE Amendment 3, but the planning area itself. I think that clearly there's a lot of pages here and ambiguity and things that aren't very defined, but there are other places where it says the maximum is 32 feet, the maximum is 55 feet. You know, there are very clear definitions of thou shall, not may, but shall do things. And those should be the first ones that we hold to. And if we change from that, we need to call that out, as you said, Mark. We need to have staff, our staff, call that out to the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission call it out to us, and then describe to us as a board, or to the board, how this is better, how this is an improvement. Because as long as it's an improvement, yes, we should consider it. But just to come and say from an applicant, I want this, I don't care about those design guidelines, I'm not gonna follow them because they don't make any sense, they were done 4 or 5 years ago, that doesn't work. You can come and say, here's something that's changed. This is we think, the applicant could say, we think as an applicant, this is an improvement for not only for the applicant, but also for the town, and this is why. And then we can consider it. But so many of these things were brought out and said, wait a second, you can't be higher, you can't be closer, you can't take away the setback, you can't take away the open space, you can't orient it to an alley instead of to a street, because it says that very specifically in here. And many of us were pushed back and said, no, we can do whatever we want, because all we have to do is say we want something different, and we'll get the change. So all I ask is that when there is a variance from the very clear thou shall, or the very maximum, minimum things that are pretty clear, no ambiguity when it says no higher than 32 feet, you know, that's very clear. Then they have to come back and ask for a variance or an amendment, if it's a big thing, to the PD plan, and it has to be described and defined why it's an improvement and in the best interest of the town. That's all I ask for. Because I know there's going to be things that are going to be easy to make a change because we say, oh yeah, that makes sense, let's do that. But when it's a pretty clear thou shall or maximum, minimum, then we have to know why we're going to even consider a variance from that.
And so oftentimes after our discussion at planning commission level, we will either approve or disapprove an application. And we will say in our notes why it was approved with the variances. And then our belief was that that then became the responsibility of the board to look at that, look at those notes, and then either support or decline the application. And that's just kind of been our understanding, and that's what it sounds like we've been initially charged with doing, what you've asked us to do. But now I'm hearing that there's a different level of specificity that you would like from us in pointing out those variances that we may approve at the planning commission level.
I think the specificity for me comes in where I'd like the planning commission to say why they approved it, not just that we agree, let them go higher or whatever. This is why this is a good improvement or a change, why it's in the best interest of the town, not that we agree with the developer to make it higher, shorter, longer, wider, or whatever it is. That's a very clear variance or discrepancy from the plan. You have to tell the board.
And that should go in the resolution as a
Right.
finding in the resolution.
Right.
The planning commission speaks through the resolution
Right.
to the board.
Okay.
So
And
that
that's a
should
really
actually
good
go in a finding
clarification.
section.
It's going to be helpful too, I think,
Mhm.
if staff is recommending support, just to have those findings already drafted ahead of time, so, yeah, we have that language already.
And I've found oftentimes staff does that.
Yeah.
But maybe there needs to be more of a reference to the specific number of the guideline that is being addressed and that it's being, a variance being asked for.
I think that's important for the applicant to come in and point that out as well, to help staff out too. I mean, honestly, the applicant's requesting a variance from something, then the applicant should point out what, give a justification for it, a reason for it, point out what's being asked for, so.
But that's not, again, that's where we've got tripped up, because the applicant has not always believed that there is in fact a variance.
I think we'll be on the same page now.
Okay, good news.
Breaking news.
Go ahead.
Okay.
That was going to be my question, is it possible to ask the applicant to identify ahead of time where he's asking for a variance?
Yeah. And then I think it's still incumbent upon staff to say, wait, we noticed something that you didn't see,
Right.
perhaps, or that you didn't agree with, and then at least have the discussion, point it out to the planning commission, point it out to the board. Because sometimes there are ambiguities in here. The flat roofs is a perfect example. There's 5 different sections that talk about flat roofs, 5. So, the applicant may not think they're asking for a variance based on a different section relating to flat roofs. So, but we at least need it to be pointed out, I think, is important.
And not just for a rooftop patio.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Which it talks about those.
It talks about rooftop terraces, it talks about 10%, there's all kinds of numbers in there about flat roofs.
Yeah.
So they're all rather conflicting and ambiguous, flat roofs being the particular one. So.
I found it fascinating, actually, that it reiterated our commitment to maximizing sunlight. And it talked about a 16% angle in the design guidelines. And because we've had that discussion recently about how's the sun going to get down if things are 3 stories tall and top isn't as what's the word, recessed. What about the intent to make sure we don't have dark streets and whatnot? Sunlight and angle was addressed in here. I didn't make the specific note of that section, but I highlighted it in my copy here.
If the board is okay with it, I entertain questions from the audience that might then spur new questions from the board, new discussion.
Yes. James Kurtz Phelan, one of the attorneys for the applicant, or for the developer, I should say. Let me make, I think there's one point that is missing from the discussion. And I tried to make it in my memo to my client that was presented to the board at the Thrive hearing. And I realized I buried it at the end of my memo. And during your discussion that evening, you didn't really focus on it, and I understand why. We could disagree about the interpretation of that particular section of the design guidelines, but it's really important to remember that the PD amendment, of which the design guidelines are a part, expressly says that in the event of a conflict between the sheets of the PD amendment itself and the design guidelines, the PD amendment sheets control. And that was the reason for our position on green courts. that the PD amendment, in our view, several sheets expressly permit and provide for green court development scenarios, and that to deny an application because it was a green court, if it conflicted with another provision of the design code, was not proper, because the PD amendment sheets are what control. And I think it's important that as you work through the review of an application, you not only look at the design guidelines, but you also look at the PD amendment itself. Because to the extent there are conflicts between the two, that's where a lot of the ambiguity comes in and a lot of the consternation on the part of the applicant. And we're following the PD amendment that we believe and expressly says it controls the event of a conflict, and then the board just disregards that rule. So I think it's important that the board keep in mind that provision of the PD amendment.
How would you respond?
Well, they were relying on photographs and other depictions in the PD amendment, which there are all kinds of depictions and photographs and examples, and so I disagree because I don't think that
was
helped.
not the intent.
I don't think that helps
Photos.
to frame the discussion. But I understand. I understand that is correct. If there is
The text.
yes, if the text of the PD amendment, if the sheet on the text, I'll just use a very straightforward example. If the text on one of the PD amendment sheets says maximum height is 32 feet, and the design guidelines say 30 feet, 32 feet controls. I think that's what this is intended to talk about. And I certainly agree with Mr. Kurtz-Phelan on that one, that if there's a direct conflict, the sheets control. But in the case that we were talking about, a lot of the reliance from the applicant was on photographs and architectural depictions on the sheets. Those I don't think are binding, and I don't know that the developer would want them to be. There are plenty of depictions and pictures on those sheets that look nothing like what is going in there. So I don't think those are ever intended to be binding. They were supposed to be representative, perhaps, but there's all kinds of things on those PDA sheets that have never been followed. As far as depictions, and I'm talking about, architectural renderings, photographs, things like that. And you can see them in the design guidelines. There's all kinds of random photographs in here of other communities. It's a little unclear sometimes what section they're even referring to, because they don't always go with the language that's next to them. But I think the PDA sheets are similar in some cases.
But I don't think you can so easily write off the drawings that are in the PD amendment. You look at the Denver City Ordinance, zoning ordinance, it has all kinds of drawings that illustrate what the setbacks are and different things in its zoning ordinance, and Denver enforces that. And you can't just write off pages of the PD amendment because they have depictions or because they have drawings that show green court with lots and with alleys behind them. It's not a drawing of a residence. It shows the design on the land that is approved by the PD amendment. And there's a rule of statutory construction that you have to give meaning to every provision of a statute or an ordinance. And the PD amendment is an ordinance. It's our zoning ordinance. So I don't think you can so easily write off the importance of the drawings that are part of the PD amendment.
Let me try to weigh in here. I think I appreciate the comment around the pictures that are illustrative. The example I gave a few weeks ago on that particular one was something I spoke about in the audience years ago, the picture of the St. Julian, right? So I think that, Kendra's point is good. Just as we can't necessarily pick and choose from the pictures, nor can you. I'm pleased the hotel is going to come up. I hope it's full. I hope we get taxis. I hope we get great visitors. But I didn't want that hotel. I wanted the St. Julian because that's the picture that was presented, right? But I came and spoke, and a number of other people came and spoke, and the developer at the time said, no, that's just an illustrative picture.
Right.
That's not what we meant. So let's just be a little careful with picking and choosing. I think it's fair for you to make a public comment. Anytime that a lawyer's going to speak, I would expect for our lawyer to respond.
We can go all night.
I think it's probably best that since we have not, quote, lawyered up, I would not suggest that you also take a lawyered up approach. I think your comments are good, they're heard, you're you're a partner to this community. We're going to be doing development applications for a long time. Let's be careful that we don't we try to pretend like the pictures are binding, because they're not. Let's go with
Can I just say a sentence about that too? And basically, to all of you who will remain, take this conversation to heart. Because a photograph may be put in something to show an elevation of the building, right? And oh, by the way, it happens to have green space next to it. You're not even looking at the green space, you're looking at the elevation of the building, right? Could, at a later time, somebody say, oh, that treatment over here was somehow improved. So you've seen it in action. Okay, so take it to heart.
Ken.
Ken Lish, 1326 South Idalia Court, and trustee candidate. I'd like to speak to the variance conversation that we had, and I appreciate the discussion of what constitutes an improvement when we're looking at variances, and we had a good conversation about that staff could identify that, and the developer could bring that as well, and then the planning commission could also weigh in on that. But the piece missing, especially when we're looking at a variance, is making sure that we have the public input, because our current residents, especially in the adjacent neighborhoods, they're the ones that are going to be impacted the most by these decisions. So if there's going to be a variance of any kind, I think there has to be an additional step taken outside of our normal operating procedures that goes to make sure we hear as much public feedback as we can to ensure it truly is an improvement. Because what you might think is an improvement, what you might think is an improvement, everybody else who, let's say, is on the southern side of the town center might have very negative ramifications for their home values, for their homes, for their experience, their quality of life. And I think that absolutely needs to be taken into account before these improvements are used to grant a variance. So I just want to make sure we can take that into account as we make these decisions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Teresa Clark, and I'm a Superior resident. And the first thing I want to say is thank you so much for having this meeting, because being a resident that has come before you on numerous occasions to try to say, but the design guidelines say this, and kind of scratching our heads thinking, wow, the planning commission let that through, and then, wow, the town staff let that through given the design guidelines. It's created a lot of resident fatigue, and that resident fatigue means that less of us are coming to the meetings and making comments because this process burned them out. And I don't think we want to do that to our residents. So thank you for doing this. And one point, to kind of reiterate what Trustee Ryan was saying about, I was at the same meeting that he was when we discussed the setbacks. And it was, the setbacks got narrowed down, and it was Trustee Williams who made a series of comments that said her concern was with the forward-facing doors and frontages for these buildings. They were talking about little decks on the front. And she wanted to, and this is how I remember it because I thought it was kind of peculiar, she wanted to make sure that the little decks were large enough to be inviting, but small enough so that homeless people wouldn't sleep on them because they faced the street. So, and I remember being at those conversations. And then my second to last kind of thing to say is that if you all are sitting on the fence, or you're feeling like something's kind of smishy in how the guidelines are interpreted, and you are really trying to figure out, what do we do, what do we not do, I would strongly prefer, as would residents, that you err in favor of the existing residents. And they're the ones who have already told you they don't want higher buildings. They want, Superior's the gateway to Boulder County. Well, our town center is this front door to Superior. And we want it to have a sense of community. We want it to have a sense of welcoming and like, wow, look at this that we have going on in Superior, and that they'll go to other places in Superior and think, wow, this is a great place. And if you keep approving these things, these monoliths and grand silos that are big walls and very dense. It's not going to have that feel of community that's inviting, that says, come on in. And then the last thing I want to say is that it's a good thing that this conversation is being had now, because I'm hoping that once you guys, now that we have this all discussed, there are things that kind of related to the design guidelines relative to the cost sharing agreement that I'd like to see us focus on, like the $10 million that we were supposed to be paid for community and civic space, like the $2 million that we're supposed to be paid. Sorry, I get out of breath sometimes. Like the $2 million that we're supposed to be paid because there's no longer a school going into the STC. And likewise, the million some odd dollars that we should, in my opinion, be paid out of TIF to pay for the landscaping of the residential buffer. So when we get this put to bed about how we're going to do this and that we're going to default to residents' preferences, let's go on and get that money. Thank you.
Bill Jennings, RC Superior. So I want to kind of dial back the whole discussion. And it's nice right now because we aren't talking about a specific application or anything like that. I'm an architect, an urban planner, a passionate supporter of new urbanism, of walkable communities, and placemaking, and creating these great, really interesting places. That's my whole career. That's what I love doing. It's what I've done other places. It's all I want to do. I don't want to argue about whether homes should face a street or a green space. Of course, I love green spaces. I think pedestrian spaces are important. But it's not worth arguing about that, especially not now, and not in this setting, and trying to argue over little pieces of words in the design guidelines and whether it's good or bad. I mean, my only goal is to be able to bring you applications that further this project, that make it possible to pay for your parks, to give you the $10 million. But all of those things are obligations once there's development to support them. TIF money isn't there unless there's private development to create those tax dollars that fund the TIF that flow through the whole project. The $10 million doesn't exist unless we approve residential and other projects that create that tax increment. And it's fine that you denied the threat application. I also don't want to argue about that. But what I don't want is to continue to bring applications that we believe are consistent and that are good projects and have them denied for things that, Mark, to your point, that we didn't see coming or that we feel like change between meetings. Because right now I kind of feel like I can't necessarily bring anything with the guarantee that it's going to be approved. And that's a problem. Because at some point, if the answer is that we just, are going to argue about nitpicky pieces of the code about what you bring in, then there's no way for this to move forward. So all that to say, we want to be a positive change in this community. We want to create a great project as fast as possible. We want to build these parks. We want to build this Main Street. But I need your help and your guidance to be able to bring applications to you that are going to get approved. Because when we waste a year and a half working with an applicant just to see a denial, if I do that 2 or 3 times in a row, I can't do anything about it. The project will stop, and it will stay like it is today for the next 10 to 20 years or however long that takes to get figured out. So, and I don't want to threaten anything. I'm just trying to be realistic about it, and I want your help. So I'm here to help however I can. If we need to set up more meetings and more design sessions to get more feedback, happy to do that. We want to, like I said, be a positive partner. We don't want to argue. So however we can get back on that cooperative track, I'm all ears.
Well, I think that one of the easiest way to reconcile and avoid those kind of last minute surprises is kind of as we were talking, to have from the outset the applicant to identify these are the areas where there may be some concern, and then having town staff do their own review of the guidelines and see if they agree with that initial identification of areas of these are the potential conflicts within the design guidelines. Let's see if we can reconcile it. Have town planning meet others, continue to have that dialogue, and then, raising it with planning commission in the memos with the public by virtue of the memos that are going to be released, and really just have them identified as clearly and as often as possible. And the more that they're done, I'm hopeful there'll be a better understanding of just how the design guidelines work, because we're paying more attention to them. And then there just won't be the surprise at the end.
Do we have a preliminary process that's an intermediate step, or could we create one? So it's more binding than a concept plan's not binding, but a preliminary FTP where they come forth and they don't do all their final engineering and they don't do all their final drainage and all their final grading, but you get these big answers approved. Courtyards versus streets, maximum heights, things like that, where the developer's not putting in a ton of money.
That was really what the PD was for.
Right.
I mean, that is the PD.
Right.
That's supposed to set forward.
But that's not working. I mean, I think.
Oh, I hear you, but I think
Yeah.
the answer then is a PD amendment. I mean, we don't have an intermediate step.
I know we don't. I didn't know if creating that was easier or amending the PD was easier, but it just feels like we need something else.
Well, we have it.
forward.
We already have it. We have the applicant come in and talks with staff for weeks before it even comes to the planning commission.
But
We
that's
are-
right. But
We already
that's
have
not-
that process.
yeah.
We have that capability, or ability, I should say. Maybe we don't have the capability, but we have the ability to actually come forward and have those discussions. And I think what happened, the surprise was kind of on our side too on some of these last applications, in that I know I asked staff many times about several things that were coming out that didn't work after they'd gone to the planning commission. I said, wait a second, this doesn't work, because this is outside of the design guidelines. So it wasn't like, boom, the night of the board meeting, it came up for the first time. So I think that we should all be on the same page here too. Many of these questions about where is the justification for the variance were basically thrown back and said, well, we're just going to take them to the board and let them decide. I don't want us to work like that. I don't want us to get into a contentious back and forth at the board meeting, because you spent weeks, Bill, with staff and then with planning commission and then 2-3 meetings with the board. This was not a surprise or a last minute kind of a thing. And what was last minute or surprise for me was that you came and said, we've met everything that's in the guidelines and that's our position. So I think that's why we're doing this. We don't want to get to that point at the meeting, the final meeting of the board, after having gone through many weeks of discussing and cussing this, to then come and say, I'm sitting on my side, you're sitting on your side, and neither of the two want to resolve this. So we know now, these are the design guideline requirements and criteria. If there's something outside of them, you just need to come and talk to us about it and justify that change.
We need to have final comments.
One final comment is, or one comment, because hopefully this started the conversation at the end. We can have sessions with our own planning department as often as we want to, as long as it's not about an active application or whatever. And some of the disconnects happening there between how planning department is interpreting and how the board is interpreting. And Rita just said something very important. We'll let the board decide. So this board can be asked its opinion on something all the time, as long as it's not an active application. So when in doubt, it should be incumbent on planning staff to seek answers during the long process, because sometimes you're working on these things for 6 months. We don't see them at all until the end of 6 months. And it's so, no wonder everybody's frustrated. Everybody's frustrated. We're frustrated. The applicant's frustrated. Everybody's frustrated. So this business of, we'll just let
Staff's
the...
frustrated.
Yeah, we'll just let the board decide. No, bring the issue.
We can if
And
the
they
application's been filed.
But there are lots of things we could be discussing in.
Or asking, or maybe.
Or
Sure. Yeah.
that
Outside, yeah.
aren't specific to a specific application. So I hope this is the beginning and that there's been an expectation laid down. Bill, what I would say to you would be, when the board does speak, it's sort of nice if we're listened to. And you know, it's a reciprocal relationship. And a lot of times we approve things on first application, sometimes it doesn't work that way. So when something is said, it needs to be listened to.
Okay, very good discussion. Thanks for all for being here and participating. And then we'll break down the tables and transition to committee interview in about 5 minutes. Jonathan Koffler to interview for the ACES committee. Jonathan, come on up. Welcome. Yes, please come to the podium. Just introduce yourself, maybe give a quick introduction.
Oh, hello. Do I?
You're good?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yes.
My name is John Koffler, and I just saw in an email that you were looking for somebody to be on the sustainability committee, and it interested me. I'm very passionate about sustainability and environmental issues, and I thought maybe I had some qualifications. I worked on a board of directors for a clean energy action group from Boulder, and I work at the Cooperative Institute of Research in Environmental Sciences and at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I feel like I have a lot of knowledge about sustainability, and thought that might be something I could contribute. And so just my idea is basically to offer what I can to contribute and help make decisions for the city.
Good. We appreciate your interest in the committee. We'll now have an opportunity for questions from the board. Chris.
So, John, my recollection is I asked you about joining this committee about 6 years ago, and so I'm happy that you're joining this because I think you're a good candidate for it. The one question I have though is that this group meets at 5:30 to 7:30, and sometimes that could be a little bit of a problem with people getting to the meetings on time after work and all that. Are you aware of that meeting time, and is that an issue?
My schedule is flexible, and it's the
Second Thursday.
Second Thursday.
Yep.
Yeah, Thursdays don't have. I generally work late hours, kind of like 10 till 6:30 or so. But my schedule is very flexible.
Okay.
So my one issue might along those lines might be, I travel a fair amount for work, usually a little less than 1 week a month, so there's chances I would be gone for meetings.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Others?
Thank you, John. So one of the, this is more of a comment than a question, but something that I'd like ACES to kind of keep top of mind. One of the metrics that we've seen in terms of sustainability is how, you know, the town of Superior stacks up against neighboring communities, Lafayette, Louisville, Boulder, and in terms of, the limited metrics that we have, but in terms of like how much people actually recycle in this town, and we're falling below our neighboring jurisdictions. So I would like ACES to really work on outreach to the community to see that we can start, going toe-to-toe with Louisville and Boulder and the other communities that are beating us on those metrics. So just something to keep in mind when you're on ACES. So, and look forward to hearing any ideas that you can have in terms of outreach to the community, educational opportunities, things that we can do to really increase environmentalism and sustainability among our residents.
Yeah. Well, I don't know all about what all the neighboring cities have, or even Superior, but I definitely would like to brainstorm, and that was my first thought, is that so much of it is just about outreach and raising awareness in the community, and having events that would do that. It seemed like that's how you get better.
Good. Any other questions? Rita?
Did you volunteer to be on the Rocky Mountain Airport study work group?
No.
Okay.
I didn't
We
know
would
about
love
that.
to have you, because there's a lot of concerns even about all of the airplanes that are now seem to be flying continuously over and around Superior, and what it's doing to greenhouse gases from those airplanes. And I'm wondering if you have a monitoring station from NOAA here in Superior, or if we could get one. If we could join the committee, can
I
we
did
get one?
have at the Erie Tower, we had one, and
Uh-huh.
I'm responsible for a network of measurement sites around the country.
Okay.
And so actually the way our towers work, we're able to sniff out different chemicals from different sources. In fact, we discovered a source of a banned substance that was starting to be produced in China.
Oh.
So it's a kind of a powerful technique, and actually there is a chance that our measurements at the Erie Tower would be able to detect things from around here.
That'd be great. We'll have to get you on the committee and then have you work on that as well. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. We appreciate your interest, and I'll just ask the final question, which I ask all of our applicants, and that is, do you have any potentials for conflict of interest, like you have a side business that might benefit in some way from your participation on the committee?
Not right now.
Okay.
Although, unless I come up with a business idea based, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
Except personal interest.
Very good. Okay. Thank you, and we'll be acting on this soon. So thank you. All right, we will adjourn and be back in less than a minute for the start of the regular meeting.